For years, girls were disappearing across parts of South America. Not in one city, not in one country, across borders. And for a long time, nobody seemed to understand how one man could keep moving and keep getting away. Then, in Ecuador, a mother saw a stranger near her daughter and refused to let him walk away. What happened next would uncover one of the darkest criminal cases in Latin American history. This is the story of Pedro Alonso López, the man later known as the Monster of the Andes. A convicted killer whose full number of victims may never be known, and whose disappearance after release would leave behind a question that still disturbs people today. How did someone this dangerous ever vanish? Pedro Alonso López was born in Colombia in 1948. Accounts of his early life describe instability, violence, and years of drifting. But what matters most for this story is what happened later, after he left prison in the late 1970s and began moving through the Andean region, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. According to later confessions and reporting, he targeted young girls, often from poor or isolated communities, and moved constantly enough to avoid easy detection. That mobility may be one reason the full scale of his crimes was so hard to piece together in real time. And this is where the story becomes even more chilling. Because before authorities fully understood what they were dealing with, there were already warning signs. In Peru, reports say he was once caught while trying to take a young girl from an indigenous community. Some accounts say local people nearly killed him before a missionary intervened, and he was handed to authorities instead. But somehow, the danger did not end there. By the time he reached Ecuador, disappearances were already building into something far more serious. Families were searching, rumors were spreading, and in Ambato, suspicion was rising around a man seen approaching girls in public places, offering them money and trying to lead them away. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a stranger in a crowd, and that may be the most disturbing part. In March 1980, in Ambato, Ecuador, that stranger approached another girl. Accounts differ on some details, but the core moment is consistent. A mother recognized the danger, confronted him, and refused to let him leave. In several versions of the story, merchants or bystanders helped hold him until police arrived. That moment changed everything, because until then, he had been one more suspicious man in a public market. After that, he became a doorway into something much larger. And at first, even then, not everyone grasped what they had. Some thought it was confusion. Some thought it was panic. Some reportedly wanted to let him go. But that mother insisted. And because she did, investigators kept pulling at the thread. Then nature exposed what people had feared. Soon after, flooding near Ambato reportedly exposed the remains of missing girls. That discovery pushed the investigation into a completely different category. This was no longer a rumor, no longer scattered disappearances that people could dismiss as coincidence. Police began connecting the suspect in custody to a wider pattern. And once interrogations intensified, López began to talk. What followed made the case infamous. Reports say López confessed to killings in multiple countries and claimed the total was in the hundreds. Not all of those claims were independently proven. But investigators in Ecuador did recover bodies after he directed them to burial sites, and authorities there accepted that the scale in Ecuador alone was extraordinarily large. One often cited figure is that at least 53 bodies were found, while López claimed many more victims across Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru. And yet somehow, even with all of that, this story still has an ending that feels impossible. Part of what made this case so shocking was not just the scale, it was the setting. Many of the alleged victims came from places with fewer resources, less protection, and less visibility. That meant disappearances could take longer to connect across towns, regions, and borders. And in a pre-digital era, a man constantly moving between countries had far more room to disappear into bus stations, markets, highways, and crowds. In other words, this was not only a story about one predator, it was also a story about how geography, poverty, and weak coordination can create space for horror to keep moving. But then came the question that still angers people. If he confessed, if bodies were found, if the threat was this obvious, how was the final punishment so limited? In Ecuador, López was convicted and sentenced under the laws of the time. But the country's maximum sentence then was far lower than many people today would expect for crimes on that scale. He received 16 years in prison in Ecuador. Later, after serving time and spending a period in a mental institution in Colombia, he was released in the late 1990s. That release remains one of the most disturbing parts of the case. Because by then, his name had already become infamous. And yet he still managed to leave custody and then fade from public view. And this is where the case stops being only history and starts feeling like a nightmare that never fully ended. After his release, López reportedly disappeared. The last reported sighting, often cited in public accounts, places him in Bogotá in 1999. Later reports say warrants were issued and investigators looked into whether he might be linked to later crimes. But his fate has remained unclear in public reporting. Some outlets later reported conflicting claims about whether he died, but the broader picture stayed unresolved enough that his disappearance became part of the legend surrounding the case. So the story people remember is not just that he was caught, it's that he was caught and still somehow became a ghost. When people hear the name Monster of the Andes, they usually focus on the scale. But the part that stays with me is something else. A crowded market, a stranger trying to blend in, a mother noticing what others might have missed, and one decision, refusing to look away, that helps stop a chain of violence. Because sometimes, history turns on huge institutions, and sometimes, it turns because one person says, "No, don't let him go." That is what makes this story so haunting. Not just the evil inside it, but the idea that it might have continued even longer if one woman had stayed silent. If you want real dark history, unexplained cases, and disturbing true stories from Latin America told with facts and suspense, subscribe to Dark Latin Files. Because some of the darkest stories on this continent are barely known outside it. And the deeper you look, the worse they get. Comment below. Do you think cases like this were made possible more by one man's cruelty or by the systems that failed to stop him sooner? And subscribe for the next case.